Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, 6 Abortion Myths, a March for Life Primer. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the right corner. When you join today's webinar, you selected to join either by phone call or computer audio. If for any reason you'd like to change your selection, you can do so by accessing your audio pane in your control panel. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. I would now like to introduce Jessica Keating, Director of the Office of Human Dignity and Life Initiatives at the McGrath Institute for Church Life.
Thank you, and thank you for everyone for joining me today. During today's webinar, we are going to be looking at 6 persistent myths about abortion that are particularly powerful in our current political climate. We're also going to discuss ways of cultivating communities that are hospitable to all life. So let's look at this quote from Pope Francis. In his first encyclical, Evangelii Gaudium, he wrote, "Among the most vulnerable for whom the Church wishes to care with particular love and concern are unborn children, the most defenseless and innocent among us. Nowadays, efforts are made to deny them their dignity and to do with them whatever one pleases, taking their lives and passing laws preventing anyone from standing in the way of this." In a little bit less than 48 hours, hundreds of thousands of people will again converge on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. to mark the 44th annual March for Life. If you ventured down to the mall this Friday, you'd find loads of different types of people, conservatives and liberals, mothers, fathers, babies. You'd find African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos and Latinas, white Americans. You'd find pregnant women and women who are post-abortive. You'd find spirited young women with blue and pink hair standing arm in arm with their gray-haired grandmothers. You'd find atheists for life, feminists for life. You'd find religious and non-religious alike. In short, you would glimpse a moment of human solidarity with those who are weakest among us, the invisible and marginalized preborn. The March for Life was founded in 1974 by Nellie Gray to commemorate the passage of Roe v. Wade and the lives lost when that decision was made in 1973. Along with Roe v. Wade, there was a lesser well-known case called Doe v. Bolton. Taken together, these Supreme Court decisions declared abortion to be a constitutional right through all 9 months of pregnancy. Using a trimester framework, the justices ruled that a state could not interfere with a woman's right to an abortion at any point during the first trimester. And the first trimester is conception to about 12 weeks. During the second trimester, that's 12 weeks to 24 weeks of gestation, the state could regulate abortion. In the second trimester, regulations had to prioritize maternal health. Regulations during the third trimester, that's 24 weeks to birth, had to include exceptions for maternal health. Now in Doe v. Bolton, that's the sister case to Roe v. Wade, the justices then broadly construed health to mean, quote, all factors of physical, emotional, psychological, familial, and the woman's age. In essence, health came to mean anything that a doctor and a patient decided it meant. With these twin rulings, the United States became one of the most permissive countries in regard to abortion. Every year since 1973, demonstrators have made their way to the nation's capital from around the country, making the March for Life the largest annual social justice demonstration in the world. And it should be mentioned that marches have sprung up all around the world, so there are sister marches to the U.S. March for Life. In recent years, the march has grown to upward of 500,000 people who brave storms and blizzards to stand up for the rights of the most defenseless and innocent among us. Estimates suggest that more than half of this year's marchers will be under the age of 30. And the shifting demographics of the March for Life actually reflect a larger reality of the pro-life movement, which is growing larger and younger, and often don't fall neatly along pre-existing political lines. Yet as the pro-life movement grows, there still exists particular kinds of cultural narratives that mystify abortion and shroud it in a utopian mythology, from the words we use to the stories we tell about abortion. During this afternoon's webinar, we're going to be looking at 6 of these myths and discuss ways of cultivating communities that are hospitable to life. Okay, so let's get started with some of the most prevalent myths about abortion. The first myth is the generational myth, and this myth says that young people are not as pro-life as their parents. The rhetoric around our abortion politics tends to give the impression that Americans' views about abortion are easily categorized along generational lines. The common wisdom is, of course, that millennials, that's today's 18 to 34-year-olds, are more pro-choice than their parents' generation. This myth trades on the stereotype that old people populate the pro-life movement in large numbers. This myth was powerfully wielded in a recent Salon article. The article was entitled, "How to Argue with Your Relatives About Abortion: A Few Arguments That Don't Work with Pro-Lifers and Some That Might." So the article imagined that a millennial would be arguing with their fictional Aunt Cheryl, and it offered advice on how a pro-choice millennial can successfully argue with her pro-life Aunt Cheryl about abortion. But once we dig into the data, we find the reality is much more complex. In fact, the generational difference might actually run in the other direction. That is, it might be Aunt Cheryl who's more likely to support unrestricted abortion, sometimes called abortion on demand, than her millennial niece. Regardless of how millennials identify, whether it's pro-choice, pro-life, both, or neither, they are less supportive of elective abortion than Gen Xers and baby boomers are today, and far less supportive than Gen Xers were when they were millennials' age. For example, Gallup reported that in the mid-1990s, 36% of 18 to 34-year-olds favored legal abortion under any circumstances. By comparison, today's millennials, that's today's 18 to 34-year-olds, only 24% of them favor legal abortion under any circumstances. Taken together, 54% of millennials say that abortion should be legal only in certain circumstances or illegal altogether. Only the silent generation, that's folks who are 70 and older, have a less favorable view of elective abortion than millennials. In fact, according to a CNN poll, millennials also lead all age groups in saying that abortion should be illegal in all circumstances. That means 23%, almost 1/4 of all millennials, believe that abortion should be illegal. We could say a lot more about the generational myth, but let's turn now to our second myth. The second myth is the liberation myth. And this myth says that abortion empowers women and is necessary for their liberation and equality in society. We have seen this myth very much so in the last week and a half. This myth was so powerful that the Washington Post recently quoted a professor at an elite university saying, quote, "Feminism is a political movement. If you are not part of the political movement, you cannot be a feminist. If you are pro-life, you are certainly not looking at the struggles across all of us." Today, it often seems like feminism and abortion rights are considered to be synonymous. However, the marriage of abortion and feminism is a relatively new phenomenon that actually didn't occur until the mid-1960s. In fact, though today's pro-life feminists are often excluded from the women's movement solely because of their stance on abortion, there's actually an unbroken chain linking today's pro-life feminists to feminist pioneers like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, women who fought against women's oppression, including the violence of prostitution and abortion. In The Revolution, a feminist newspaper, on January 29, 1868, Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote, "We are living today under a dynasty of force. The masculine element is everywhere overpowering the feminine, crushing women and children alike beneath its feet. Let women assert herself in all her dignity and strength and end this wholesale suffering and murder of helpless children." These women and their contemporaries abhorred abortion, believing not only that it killed a preborn child, but that it was also antithetical to women's liberation. Like their foremothers, today's pro-life feminists take up the cause of women's full liberation, which can't be gained by passing violence on to our sons and daughters in the womb. Feminists as diverse as Sidney Callahan and the late Andrea Dworkin were very suspicious that abortion could truly liberate women. In her famous essay, Abortion and the Sexual Agenda, A Case for Pro-Life Feminism, Callahan observes that feminine and fetal liberation are inextricably connected. She says, quote, "Permissive abortion laws do not bring women reproductive freedom, social equality, social fulfillment, or personal fulfillment. Pragmatic failures of a pro-choice feminist position, combined with a lack of moral vision, are, in fact, causing disaffection among young women. Middle-aged pro-choice feminists blame the big chill on the general conservative backlash. But they should look rather to their own elitist acceptance of male models of sex and to the sad picture they present of women's lives. Pitting women against their own offspring is not only morally offensive, it is psychologically and politically destructive. Women will never climb to equality and social empowerment over mounds of dead fetuses, now numbering in the millions. As long as most women choose to bear children, they stand to gain from the same constellation of attitudes and institutions that will also protect the fetus in the woman's womb. And they stand to lose from the cultural assumptions that support permissive abortion." For pro-life feminists, abortion is symptomatic of women's oppression because, and to quote Sidney Callahan one more time, it represents the abandonment of women and children. It legitimizes the view that pregnancies and children are a woman's private concern and her individual responsibility. So permissive abortion laws erode the responsibility of communities and fathers for their children and make women's equality dependent on their willingness to participate in violence. Now moving on to our third myth. The third myth is the social good myth. And this myth basically says that abortion isn't just a necessary social evil. It's actually a positive social good. So abortion is good for society. In the early days of advocacy for access to elective abortion, proponents described abortion as a necessary social evil. In a recent book, Defenders of the Unborn, the Pro-Life Movement Before Roe v. Wade, historian Daniel Williams recalls that even the strongest proponents of abortion in the 1920s believed that abortion was an evil and called it, quote, "not a nice thing." Despite their dislike for abortion, these advocates, however, argued that fetal life can and should be sacrificed for a greater social good. And even as recently as the late 1990s, advocates for elective abortion continued to argue on the grounds of abortion as a necessary social evil, coining the phrase safe, legal, and rare. And this rhetoric lingered on through the late 90s and into the early 2000s, but a new narrative was starting to emerge, a narrative that declared that abortion is an act of empowerment and liberation, and that it is a social good. Somewhere around the early to mid-2000s, the rhetoric of abortion as a positive social good became increasingly prevalent. Abortion was now described as a boon for families, for the economy, and for women's advancement. It was celebrated as an unqualified positive social good. The 2005 bestseller Freakonomics, the authors Stephen Levitt and Stephen Dubner famously linked the rise of abortion to the decrease in crime. So they correlated increases in abortions to decreases in crime. This claim was roundly critiqued and eventually rejected, but it did seep into the social imaginary. And in September of 2015, we see things like the hashtag Shout Your Abortion campaign, which was launched in an effort to, quote, destigmatize abortion. Others have even filmed their abortions and described them as positive experiences, quote, like giving birth. Yet despite the heralding of abortion as a positive social good, there's actually little evidence to support the idea that abortion is linked to women's economic, social, or educational mobility. Indeed, we are beginning to see the kinds of long-term economic and social effects consistent with the widespread practice of abortion in other countries. Some theorists suggest that when you eliminate people from the population, you necessarily eliminate innovation. In addition, we are beginning to see the kinds of demographic imbalance, a rapidly aging population without enough workers to support it. In fact, some economists estimate that we lose nearly $70 to $125 billion of economic activity per year. We can't leave out the question of racial injustice. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, African Americans make up roughly 13% of the U.S. population. Yet according to the Center for Disease Control, African American women comprise over 30% of all women seeking abortion. This means that regardless of its intention, abortion providers not only exist in a milieu of systemic racism, but are also actually involved in perpetuating that system of racial injustice by eliminating the African American population. So we've looked at our first three myths: the generational myth, the liberation myth, and the social good myth. Now let's look at the better off dead myth. This myth says that the preborn child is better off dead, that abortion is good for the unborn. And alarmingly, this myth is on the rise. It basically says that some people are better off dead than adopted, depressed, poor, or disabled. This argument is basically the same one that is used to justify physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, only instead of being applied at the end of life, it's applied to the preborn. The Salon article that I mentioned earlier offers this as an effective way to argue with pro-life supporters. And I'll quote the article in full here. The author writes, quote, "Unintended pregnancies carry risks for the child too. Aunt Cheryl should also know that women who aren't prepared to care for children or have adequate support are statistically more likely to neglect and abuse such children after they're born. They are more likely to suffer depression and less likely to bond, and less likely to seek prenatal care, and more likely to experience domestic violence during pregnancy. Their babies are more likely to die even in the absence of abortion." End quote. So the logic here we see is that you're better off dead than neglected. The author continues, citing the widely rejected Freakonomics study, saying that children of unintended pregnancies are less likely to succeed in school, more likely to be poor and receive government assistance, and eventually more likely to participate in criminal activity. The evidence the author uses is shaky at the very best, relying heavily on what social scientists call correlations, but not causations. So for example, is it really pregnancy that causes the outcomes, or is it poverty, lack of financial resources, or support? The church must stand with women who are abused and neglected, stand against that abuse and that neglect, and to give women the resources that they need in order to welcome their children or to consider adoption. These statistics that the author cites actually says a lot more about the society we live in than about pregnancy as such. The better off dead argument sets an alarming precedent that we can decide someone else's worth based on their economic standing, their intelligence, or their ability, or on their prospective life chances. It is precisely the kind of logic that has led to an alarming increase in abortion when a child receives a poor prenatal diagnosis. In fact, estimates suggest that somewhere around 67% of children diagnosed with Down syndrome those pregnancies are terminated. So moving on from the better off dead myth, and I'll try to remember to advance my slides appropriately, to the not a human being myth. This myth says the preborn child is not a human being. So this myth is continually debunked by science, yet it just won't go away. Just yesterday, The Atlantic ran an article that claims the preborn child is not a human being and says that ultrasound technology is a tool of patriarchy that basically produces a heartbeat. So this is an interesting claim that keeps coming back, given the fact that the U.S. actually exported portable ultrasound machines that facilitated gender-selective abortion abroad in countries like China and India. Nevertheless, way back in 1852, another pro-life feminist, Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, who was the first American woman to receive her MD, wrote, quote, "Look at the first faint gleam of life, the life of the embryo, the commencement of human existence. We see this tiny cell so small that it may be easily overlooked. There is in that simple germ cell something wonderful, life. It is a living cell. It contains the power of progressive growth according to laws towards a definitive type that we can only regard with reverent admiration. Scientists agree that a new genetically distinct self-directed human life begins during the process of fertilization. Any basic biology textbook will tell you this. Uninterrupted, a human pregnancy will end in the birth of a human baby. Yet efforts still continue to deny the preborn child her full humanity. Sometimes this means denying her humanness. We still occasionally hear the blob of tissue argument. Yet more often, philosophers and pro-choice advocates opt for arguments against the preborn child's personhood, saying, okay, this person might be a human being or a human entity, but it hasn't achieved personhood. And then they set the bar so high that most of us would not achieve personhood during our waking hours, and certainly none of us would be persons while we're asleep. So this argument sort of falls apart on its very internal inconsistencies. Certainly the infant child would not be a person. Most of us would not be persons most of our lives. Over 100 years after Elizabeth Blackwell, physician and novelist Walker Percy penned an op-ed for the New York Times entitled "A View of Abortion with Something to Offend Everybody." And here's what he wrote. As a novelist, I can recognize a con job when I hear it. The current con, perpetrated by some jurists, some editorial writers, and some doctors, is that since there is no agreement about the beginning of human life, it is therefore a private, religious, or philosophical decision, and therefore the state and the courts can have nothing to do about it. This is a con. I will not presume to speculate who is conning whom for what sake and what purpose. I do submit that religion, philosophy, and private opinion have nothing to do with this issue. I further submit that it is commonplace of modern biology, known to every high school student, and no doubt to you, the reader, as well, that the life of every individual organism, human or not, begins when the chromosomes of the sperm fuse with the chromosomes of the ovum to form a new DNA complex that therefore directs the organism. Please indulge the novelist if he thinks in novelistic terms. Picture the scene: a Galileo trial in reverse. The Supreme Court is cross-examining a high school biology teacher and admonishing him that, of course, it is only his personal opinion that the fertilized human ovum is an individual human life. He is enjoined not to teach his private beliefs at a public school. Like Galileo, he caves in, submits, but in turning away is heard to murmur, "But it's still alive." Okay, let's move on to our last myth, the maternal health myth. This myth says that abortion is necessary to ensure maternal health. And we often hear this myth in the field of international development. According to the World Health Organization, there are about 50 to 60 million abortions a year worldwide. Abortion rights advocates often speciously link maternal health to abortion. This claim is often heard in international development circles by organizations like Planned Parenthood Federation International, among others. Yet there's very little evidence to support that access to abortion actually influences maternal health. The United States has some of the most permissive laws in the world when it comes to abortion, yet ranks 61st in maternal health, the worst among industrialized countries, while countries like Ireland and Israel, which have some of the world's stricter abortion laws, far outrank the U.S. in terms of maternal welfare. Outcomes for children are also poor in the United States. U.S. mortality rate for children under 5 is comparable with that of Serbia, Macedonia, and Slovakia. The same things that make abortion safe are actually the same things that make pregnancy safe. And what are those things? It's access to trained attendants, it's sterile equipment, it's a clean environment. So the link between abortion and maternal health is a weak one. It's very specious because what makes pregnancy safe and delivering a child safe are the same things that make abortion safe. And remember, abortion is never safe for the unborn child. Okay, so we've looked at 6 myths. We've looked at the generational myth, we've looked at the liberation myth, the social good myth, the better off dead myth, the not a human being myth, and the maternal health myth. These are important to know how to argue against in the public sphere because they're out there and they're powerful. Let's think now about some ways of cultivating communities that are hospitable to life. So what can we do in our concrete circumstances? Well, the first thing is to look around and see what needs are there. In terms of helping women who are either abortion prone or post-abortive, there are many things we can do. We can offer adoption. Adoption in our churches needs to be promoted much more than it currently is. We can support our local pregnancy centers. We can do meals for new moms and new families. We can smile at parents. I know that seems like nothing at all, but smile at parents who are struggling with a child in the grocery store or even at Mass. Do diaper drives. Help people in these small but symbolic ways that help to build and cultivate a culture that is hospitable to life. Another thing we can do is to practice the works of mercy. Cultivating mercy is a constant practice, and to be merciful to a woman in need, we cultivate that. It doesn't just appear out of nowhere. We cultivate that throughout a life of practicing mercy. So practicing the works of mercy to reach out to those people who are in greatest need in our communities. And I call that last one, practice mercying. So that completes the content portion of our webinar. I'd now like to take time for questions, and hopefully I can give you some answers to those questions. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jessica. We're now going to begin answering the questions submitted during today's presentation. As a reminder, you can still submit your questions through the questions pane of the control panel. So, Jessica, our first question is what would happen if Roe versus Wade were overturned?
That's a great question. A lot of people think that if Roe v. Wade or Doe v. Bolton were overturned tomorrow, abortion would become illegal. Actually, it's a little bit more complicated than that. It would go back to the states, and states before Roe v. Wade had varying laws with regard to abortion, some more permissive and some less permissive. So most states had provisions that a woman, in the strictest circumstances, the woman would come before a hospital board and they would discuss the medical implications of her case. So actually what would happen is overnight the statute would go back to the states, and each state would be responsible for adjudicating those laws.
All right, thank you. Next question is just what's the source we can cite for the statistics that more than half of the marchers this year will be under the age of 30?
Sure, you can go to the March for Life website. They talk about the youth in the march, and I believe Charles Camosi's book, Beyond the Abortion Wars, also talks about this a bit. That's a great book just for documenting the growing youthfulness of the pro-life movement. That's a great question. Thank you.
All right, our next question. What about illegal abortions? If abortion is illegal, won't more women die?
That's a great question, and I'm really glad that you asked. The reality is that legality didn't make abortion safe for women. We need to understand that over the course of human history, pregnancy and childbirth and abortion have been some of the most dangerous things that a woman could do. But it was penicillin, which was developed in the 1940s, that made pregnancy safer and also actually caused a huge reduction in the number of women's lives lost for an attempted abortion. So it wasn't legalization that made abortion magically safe. It was actually penicillin, the drug that fights infection, that made that reduced the mortality in women who illegally sought abortions. It also made carrying a child to term and delivering safely a possibility too for the first time.
All right, thank you. Our next question, how can we respond lovingly when challenged by abortion supporters who say that the government cannot tell a woman what to do with her body?
Yeah, so I actually totally agree that the government shouldn't tell us what to do with our bodies. The thing about abortion is that we're talking about two bodies. So we're talking about a woman's body, but we're also talking about a distinct other human being who is presently inside of a woman's body. And so it's thinking about the temporary period of pregnancy versus the entire life lost of that human being that is in a woman's womb during that time. I also think we need to recognize that actually the government tells us very often what to do with our bodies. It tells us when we have to stop at stoplights. It passes all kinds of laws that regulate what we can and cannot do. Now this is a very intimate case, but I think in weighing pregnancy and the bodily toll that takes, which is huge, there is a sacrifice involved in carrying a child to term. Against the life that is lost through abortion, the government has a duty to protect that unborn life while providing all the support to women who are carrying their children in the womb. That means medical care, that means daycare, that means family leave, that means much more supportive policies than we currently have in this country. And we don't get those policies by making abortion legal. We get those policies by standing up for our children and our families.
All right, thank you very much. The next question is I know someone at my church who had an abortion. I see her on Sundays, and I'm not sure what to say to her. Do you have any advice?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot would depend on whether this woman has confided in you. I certainly, if I just knew through the grapevine that she had had an abortion, would probably not approach her. You don't know what kind of emotional space she's in, what she actually needs at that time. What I would make sure, and the circumstances are different if she has confided in you, and the best thing you can do in that case is to listen and to help her avail herself of the sacrament of reconciliation. The other thing all churches can be doing is promoting post-abortive healing through wonderful networks like Project Rachel and Rachel's Vineyard that help women to heal and become whole again after they've experienced an abortion. Great question.
All right, thank you. Our next question is, what about overpopulation? Who will take care of the unwanted children?
Yeah, this is a great question too. So a lot of folks will use the argument that look at all the children we have in foster care who don't have homes. Well, foster care is a very broken system and tragic in many ways, but it's different than adoption of an infant. Foster care are children who are with their families and had to be taken from their families for some reason. There are actually a great number of Americans who want to adopt. And remember that children in foster care often aren't, they're going to go back to their families. That's the goal, is reunification with their families. There's actually many people who want to adopt who cannot adopt because there are a decreasing number of children who are there who need adoption. And that is partly due to actually two things. The rise in abortion, but also the decline in stigma of single-parent homes, that's a good thing. The abortion aspect of it is not a good thing. So there's that piece. In terms of overpopulation, this question has a long history. Actually, we don't see the word overpopulation until the late 19th century. It doesn't make its way into the English language until I think around 1870. And overpopulation, actually, it's countries like the United States that are using the world's resources. So when we think about overpopulation, we usually think about countries like Asia and Africa. We're not in danger of overpopulation really anywhere in the world if we start using our resources. So the overpopulation argument is common. It's common in terms of pushing international abortion and also birth control, but it is a fairly specious claim. In fact, some of the most densely populated areas are the areas that use energy the most efficiently. So between adoption and innovation and technology, I think that that argument is not a good argument for promoting abortion.
All right, thank you. The next question is long, so bear with me while I read it.
Okay.
Following the Women's March, I have seen several friends and family members post on Facebook and other forms of social media that they are Catholic and pro-choice, which seems extremely contradictory to me, especially after hearing you explain each of these myths. How would you suggest we pastorally and lovingly explain to them that doctrine and theology behind that is actually means to be pro-life?
Yeah, that's a tough question and a great question. Thank you for asking. I think the first thing to recognize is that most of the folks that you're talking about, Catholic women who are pro-choice, believe that they are supporting something that is good for women and maybe even good for children. I think the challenge for people who are pro-life and feminist and whole life pro-life is to help connect abortion to a lot of the other social justice issues that people like that care about. So if, the Women's March proposed fighting for people with disabilities, well, that means fighting for people with disabilities in the womb too. If we don't preserve life when it's at its most vulnerable, then we find ourselves on very shaky ground to preserve life and to protect life at other stages too. One of the things about being Catholic and being a follower of Christ is that we give up the right to pick and choose whose lives are valuable and whose lives are not valuable. I think one of the very practical things to do is to have a conversation, to build bridges, but also to explain, to use the resources that you have to explain why protection of the unborn is consistent both with their, I assume, social justice views, but also with their faith as a Catholic. That in defending the most vulnerable, we are defending all people. It's like the preferential option for the poor. If we don't defend the poor, then none of us have any ground to stand on. Abortion is the first issue among life issues because that is where life is most fragile and most defenseless. So I think a really important thing is to get educated, know what the myths are, and be prepared to answer those objections passionately and kindly and with a lot of resources and knowledge.
All right, thank you, Jessica. The next question is, can you go a little more in depth about how you to detangle women's empowerment and abortion?
Sure. So this was back for everyone else in the liberation myth. So basically the idea of pro-life feminism, there's a consistent sort of movement from the beginning of American feminism to now that has been pro-life. And the idea is that women are not fully empowered if they have to make choices that enact violence against others. So that actually women are made to sort of act like men in order to get ahead, and that means not bearing children. So the idea of pro-life feminism is to say, actually, the policies that are going to protect children in the womb are the same policies that are going to help women. The policies that are going to help families are the same policies that are going to help women. So that women can't be truly empowered by having to become and behave like men, childless, wombless. And that their true empowerment comes from advancing a whole life perspective that honors life in the womb and that also honors life outside the womb. It's also not clear that women have benefited economically from abortion. There tends to be some studies that suggest that women get ahead either in their education or economically. Actually, there's not clear evidence that there is movement between educational and economic advancement because of abortion. So we actually are starting to think that abortion has this corrosive effect on women's true liberation, which doesn't mean becoming like men. It means being women and being valued equally for being women. It also makes, abortion also makes childbearing a woman's private prerogative. If she won't get an abortion, well, then I don't have to take care of this child. So it really, it erodes the responsibility that communities and fathers have for their children as well. So yeah, I hope that was helpful. Great question.
Thank you. Our next question is, what do you say to population experts who argue our Earth cannot handle a substantial increase in population?
Yeah, so there have been population experts saying that for over 100 years now, and the Earth does actually manage to sustain itself. Now, what we are seeing is the misuse of resources. So there's no consensus among population experts that an expanded population will necessarily lead to the Earth's demise. What actually is causing a strain on the Earth are first world countries draining third world countries of their resources. So while we often say that the population problem is our overpopulated developing countries, it's more nearly the resources that countries who are developed are using. Again, I think I mentioned this already, some of the areas that use energy most efficiently are the most densely populated. So with human innovation, and remember we sort of cut off human innovation when we cut off large parts of our population, there's advancement that helps to figure out how to address those problems. So the population argument, so in the 1960s, Paul Ehrlich and his wife predicted the population bomb. And that did not come to fruition. Actually, Paul Ehrlich and his wife Anne were later quoted as saying it was countries like the United States and developed countries that were putting the greatest strain on the global economy, not because of people, but because of the vast misuse of resources. Great question.
All right. Our next question is, when I have said that women deserve better than abortion, I have been countered with arguments that children deserve more than being neglected, abused, born addicted to drugs, etc. I know you talked about this in the better off dead myth, but can you address these more specifically?
Yeah, so again, adoption is an underutilized reality in the United States. So again, when we're thinking about neglected children, okay, well, if somebody is really not prepared to welcome their child into their home, there are people who are desperate to adopt children, and they far outnumber the current number of children that are waiting to be adopted. So there's that, and we shouldn't underestimate that. And we also need to make adoption an easier, more streamlined process, and not one that requires you to be a wealthy person in order to adopt, but to provide a loving home. In terms of drug addiction, again, there are resources that can help children who are drug addicted as they develop, and to address those needs as they develop. I think the underlying question that we need to ask people who say that question, who pose that that challenge, is how are we going to adjudicate, how would they like to adjudicate who deserves to live and who is better off dying? Is it just this group of people, or can that expand to more people and more people? The logic is a self-perpetuating logic that has no verifiable end in sight. So it's, you mentioned drug addicted and neglected. Well, both of those things are things that can be ameliorated, things that have resources to help address them. But is it then disabled children? Is it then girls? Is it then, so there's no way to cut off that logic once you start going in that direction. The only way to cut it off is the whim of who's in power. And that's a dangerous road to start going down. So I think that you would want to appeal to that when that logical sort of thread when you're talking to them, but also talking about the resources that are available, talking about the reality and beauty of adoption, that there are people willing to take, that want to welcome children who have special needs into their homes. So I think you want to provide a vision of something that is appealing and beautiful, in addition to sort of pointing out the logical flaws in an argument. Great question.
All right. Well, thank you, Jessica. With that, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. I'd like to thank you, Jessica, and thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar, 6 Abortion Myths, a March for Life Primer. If you have any other questions, you can email Jessica, and Jessica's email can be found on the slide. Jessica, if you want to move that over, perfect. Thank you. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on today's presentation, and we'd appreciate it if you would complete that and provide your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view the recording of today's webinar. On behalf of the McGrath Institute for Church Life and the Office of Human Dignity and Life Initiatives at the University of Notre Dame, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.